Thank you for being here. My name is Serena Duvall, and I'm a part of the art history program at CPAD. And my research set out to explore how Nancy Grossman's art is influenced by Jewish social history and how her work embodies this identity within mid-century American modern art, if at all. And what I found is that although Nancy Grossman does not call herself Jewish and her work does not directly discuss Jewishness, her art practice is innately tied to Jewish social history through her use of garment work. All right, so before we get into that, who is Nancy Grossman? Nancy Grossman is a third-generation American artist born in 1940 New York. She's the eldest daughter of Jewish dressmakers, and she worked in their dress factory as soon as she turned 16. She's most well known for these leather head sculptures at the right, but she's also worked extensively in collage, draftsmanship, and painting. But despite her rich practice, her work is primarily discussed in regards to the shocking implications it carries, so the sadomasochistic aesthetics that her work is similar to, and how her gender as a woman amplifies that shock, especially as she calls these, specifically the leather head sculptures, self-portraits. So as a result, her background and its impact on viewing her work has largely been neglected, and discussions around her were kind of reliant on the sensationalism of gender. And my research aims to supplement this gap and also to expand on what this American identity of hers entails. So I mentioned before that Grossman's parents were garment workers and that they owned their own dress factory. And when looking at these fabricated head sculptures, it's not hard to connect Grossman's family trade to her art practice. So to point out some things, like on this leather head sculpture, there are darts around here in these seams, and that's a sewing technique that creates the 3D form. And this technique would have been taught to Grossman while working as what she calls a dart and gusset girl in her parents' factory. And garment work is also incorporated in her 2D works, so this collage here on the right, the blackened shape over the human figure acts as a mask and is a pattern, a painted pattern sheet. And so patterns are templates for cutting out fabric, desired fabric pieces before those pieces are sewn together into the final product. They've been integral to the garment industry since the early 19th century. And so this pattern in particular was originally used by Grossman to cut out pieces for the leather head sculptures, but then she repurposed it and painted over it to use in this collage. And so looking at the materials that she uses, it's quite obvious that her practice is largely influenced by these garment techniques and garment materials that she would have been exposed to by her parents. But what does garment work have to do with Jewish history? Quite a lot. So it's probably not a coincidence that her father was involved in the New York garment industry, or that he was born in Cleveland, Ohio. New York was and still is considered a capital of fashion production, and in the early 20th century, Cleveland ranked close behind New York as the leading Midwestern clothing producer. So both cities' garment industries were largely owned and operated by Jewish immigrants. And from a chapter on the Jewish garment industry by Phyllis Dillon and Andrew Godley, they connect the influx of Jewish garment workers in the early 20th century to anti-Semitic legislation in European countries. So these laws, which are called pogroms or May laws depending on the location, restricted Jewish people to specific trades and other such restrictions. So one of the trades they were allowed to work in was the textile industry. And so eventually, as Jewish Europeans immigrated elsewhere, like the U.S., they were able to transfer their skills and experience within the European textile industry into the American textile industry. And this resulted in the majority of workers in the early 20th century American garment industry to be Jewish immigrants. So it is unclear if Grossman's grandparents were involved in the textile or garment industries in their home countries, but I did find a U.S. Census sheet from 1920 and a directory from 1907, which lists an Isaac Grossman, which would have been her paternal grandfather, along with like all the matching information. And it lists him, Isaac Grossman, working as a tailor in Cleveland, so about 30 13 years, and around the time that her Nancy Grossman's father would have been born. So Phyllis Dillon and Andrew Godley, that the same research, they also discussed a tactic used by a lot of Jewish business owners in the U.S., in which these Jewish business owners would more readily hire Jewish workers or other Jewish immigrants, just because that diminished the potential for anti-Semitism in the workplace and established some cultural grounding between everyone. So even if the Grossmans did not have prior garment experience before immigrating, it's still likely that their Jewishness contributed to Isaac receiving that job from someone in their community. So to bring it back to Nancy herself, her work obviously continues and immortalizes this incidental history of Jewish immigrants in the garment trade, which by itself is quite significant. But this connection to her and her family through art work, and at least her immediate family, is also significant to understanding her artistic intent. Arlene Raven, an art historian, says that Grossman's body of work is an inquiry into the dilemmas and difficulties of her childhood. So you may have noticed that there's a common theme within Grossman's work of being bound down or confined, which is facilitated through these references to garment work, like the pattern or the fabric itself or the stitching. And this is perhaps a response to her experiences in adolescence of feeling tied down to the parental responsibilities thrust on her as the eldest daughter. And Nancy Grossman has talked in interviews about how her father tried to keep Grossman from continuing her school and to keep her in a parental role with them so she can watch over her younger siblings and help around the house. And he even asked her to leave Pratt University, where she was just beginning to study art, in order to continue supporting the family. So obviously she didn't, but there is a clear symbolic connection between her father's attempts to bind Grossman down and her literal artistic response of binding these busts down with the leather work, especially as she referred to these works as self-portraits. And this isn't just seen in her leatherheads, but going back to this collage in the middle, the shape that the mask makes over the face is very similar to a house with the simplified square and the triangle as a roof. And so, again, the material of the mask, shaped like a house, is made from a pattern, innately tying it back to garment work. And so Grossman is, again, expressing how her family, or maybe even just the trade of garment work, is constricting and suffocating to her agency. So to pivot back to a broader scope, what are the artistic implications of this connections between Jewish history and textile art? So acknowledging how even in Grossman, who is a person who doesn't call herself Jewish or directly incorporate Judaism in her work, even with Grossman, this historic connection between garment work and Jewish social history is still running through because it has become intertwined with secular labor. And so if this connection has influenced Grossman, it's very likely influenced other Jewish makers or Jewish descendant makers. And so this alters the way we might look at modern Jewish art and leads to further questions about the role Jewish makers have in American history, why that is, and possibly what common themes or modes of making they're utilizing, and what that potentially reveals about how artists are conveying the Jewish experience in modern America through their practices. So I don't have any pictures of this, but immediately I'm already thinking of prominent mid-century Jewish artists like Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro, and they both have incorporated textile and needlecraft into their art practice. And similar to Grossman, they're also considered feminist artists who use craft and subvert the domestic association with it. Shapiro with the advent of femage, and Chicago utilizing embroidery in works like the Birth Project. So just between these three artists and many more within the mid-century American modern art, this pattern I'm noticing strikes me as significant, considering that many Jewish immigrants arriving at the turn of this century were thrust into economic hardship. So these artists' identities and their incorporation of craft may not simply be coincidence, but points to craft's accessibility and its familial significance to artists marginalized at points on gender and religion. No, that's it. Do I have any questions?
I notice in the sculptures, one thing I see that really stands out is the nose. Oftentimes it's white. So why is that the case?
So I believe that she herself has said like it's not to reference the Jewish nose, but instead, I believe it's because these sculptures are meant to convey that she is confined but still breathing, and that is how she felt living with her parents and having to take care of like her younger siblings. She was alive and breathing, but she didn't have agency. So it's just kind of like kept in a bubble.
So the white nose symbolizes breathing and
Yes.
life.
Yes.
Life goes on.
Despite like being suffocated.
How do you think, well, is she still working today?
She is. She still works in Brooklyn. Yeah. I don't know how active she is, but yeah.
Because I'm thinking that with these 3D measurements and 3D sculptures, there must be tools that she would be using now
Yeah.
that could make this a little bit easier.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she's not very public in interviews and such, so it's been hard to get an idea of her specific process aside from like photographs of her working.
You could probably interview her. You
I
got
tried.
credentials now.
I tried.
You tried.
I
Oh,
heard
good.
Valerie said she's not taking any questions. I know, unfortunately, but yeah, I'll probably try again in the future.